What's up, YouTube? Capital G here. Okay, so Inzektors 1 YCS Seattle Tacoma. What does this mean? In my personal opinion, there are two things that I can say emphatically. That's number one, this deck is going to see an increase in competitive play. Not just limited to something like dual network, but even on the regional circuit, I'm talking premier events, you're going to see a rise in play of Inzektors just because it's simple. I mean, net deckers are going to come out of the woodwork. You're going to have people like me who, are curious about decks to see just, is this deck as good as it was advertised? And they're going to want to test the deck. People who aren't as good deck building as they are maybe taking a structurally sound deck and just flat out playing it at an event. You're also going to have everybody kind of be part of the overreaction police. You're going to have people who, oh my goodness, this is the greatest deck ever, making videos about it. This is how we need to beat this deck. And it's just like, chill the fuck out, bro. I mean, this is the first time Inzektors have ever won a YCS. Let's not be overreaction police, and let's realize that this deck has been around forever. I mean, it was kind of a perfect storm where people were playing a lot less hand traps. Decks with no traps were heavily prevalent at this event, and I mean, the guy played what was in front of him and just happened to win. Now, I'm not going to be a prisoner of the moment. I'm not going to come up here and say just because I played Inzektors in the past and you guys might think that this is a hint of bias, it's the greatest deck ever. I mean, let's just be real about this. It's much more likely that a deck like Dino Rabbit or Agents will win the next YCS versus Inzektors winning another YCS this format, because we've had 5 different events and 5 different decks have won. I mean, it's just that type of format. Now, I would say almost certainly the numero uno reason that the YCS champion won was because his deck was structurally sound. It was effective in almost every aspect. I mean, I even look at my regional deck and I think, man, if I could go back in hindsight, there are a lot of cards that I would have adjusted. Number one, Inzektors have always struggled with the turn 1 going first opening play. They don't have a move that can put a lot of offensive pressure on their opponent. You have decks like Dino Rabbit where it can put Doka plus protection, Logia plus protection, and those put a lot of pressure on you. Windups have Shock Lock. I mean, last format, Dragons had Future Fusion. All of those plays have you staring down a big boss monster, and you have very limited options as to how you want to address that. Generally speaking, your opponent will make advantage in other ways possible, like Shock Lock where they have multiple monsters. Dino Rabbit, I mean, you're talking just free negations like Solemn Judgment, Double Divine Wrath, and then Chaos Dragons, they toolbox their entire graveyard. Now, Inzektors, because they can't use Hornet effectively turn 1, they've kind of been reduced to offensively going first turn 1 to basically the Inzektors Sword, Ladybug, Centipede play, which is pretty good because generally speaking, if your opponent can't get over your 2400 guy, if they somehow kill it, you just add the Centipede back to your hand. If they somehow, try and use any backer removal, they'll just trigger your Centipede in which you can just search a card. But overall, that's pretty much been the limitations of the deck. Now, he did something smart. Not only did he give himself a good defensive outlet turn 1 in case he knew that he was playing something like a bad matchup somehow, or he just didn't have a hand that was very offensive based, he could easily set something like Spirit Reaper and know that pretty much whatever his opponent threw at him, he was going to be in a pretty good position. Not to mention, he also had cards like Card D, which could expand his options. Now, Card D is it's a risky card because you have to have the back row there to protect you, and sometimes you can set back row, but if your opponent has a way to fight through that, you can still end up getting OTK'd or really, getting beat down badly. But he had Threatening Roar to back up those plays. Threatening Roar being chainable, thus, I mean, if you have Card D, you draw, that +1, you set the Threatening Roar. Yeah, Threatening Roar might be a neg one, but the Card D mitigates that. Not to mention, if your opponent doesn't OTK, you're sitting on a free roar next time. Now, Threatening Roar was the single biggest reason, in my personal opinion, he won a lot of his game 1s. Read the feature match in the finals. I tested this card with Inzektors right after I saw the Detroit Regionals where I dropped Safe Zone, and I was like, my goodness, Threatening Roar is amazing. And I told you guys the reason is because once you get Hornet rolling, your opponent basically cannot commit to the board. As long as you can keep an Inzektor on the board, it's even better if you have multiple ones. Your opponent basically has to kill your Inzektor using some type of spell and traps. And I mean, a lot of traps aren't going to kill monsters unless you're like summoning into a Torrential Tribute. With spells, pretty much Dark Hole or Bust. And even with monsters, there's not a lot of a monster a monster effect negation. I mean, you've got like Doka and Photon Strike Bouncer. They're both pretty difficult cards to make. So, I mean, there aren't many outs if you have a Centipede plus like a Ladybug and Hornet in the graveyard. Your opponent can't commit any back row. They can't commit any monsters. And then it's just like, okay, well, I'm just going to slow roll this game until we get to a simplified game state to where I can just push you know, for game. Now, not to mention, if you don't commit to the board, your opponent can just use things like Inzektors, blow their own stuff up, Gigamantis, and just special until they can OTK you. Another avenue that I thought that he took to success was the fact that, I mean, he played what was in front of him. You look at the format right now and how it's shaping up. You know, you have all these decks that don't really play traps like Mermail, Atlanteans, and Chaos Dragons. Well, have fun just getting your shit pushed in when your opponent summons Dragonfly and it's like, oops, I don't really have anything to stop that. I don't have a Torrential, I don't have a Book of Moon, I don't have an evac. It's either Effect Veiler or bust. Oops, I don't have Effect Veiler. Okay, guess I lose. Same thing goes with a deck like Agents. I mean, if you're not playing back row against a deck like Inzektors, you're kind of losing half the battle. And then we've already stated, when you try and commit to the board, you try and put all your offensive pressure on them, they just flip over Threatening Roar, and it's like, oh, now you have a big field of monsters. I'll just have fun blowing them up with Hornet, you know, time and time again. One matchup that I do think can be problematic, and I think that this matchup is absolutely horrible, is against Macro Rabbit. You look at a deck like Joe Gerlando's deck, Doka still exists, which absolutely destroys Inzektors. I mean, there's a reason why in 2 regionals I went 7-0 against Inzektors running Dino Rabbit. I made a very good, lucrative business, you know, basically just wrecking that deck because Doka was a card. Macro being in the main deck hurts the deck even more, and if you're like me, you're running Fiendish Chain, oh my goodness, it's just a nightmare. Not to mention things like Guaiba, it's just, it can be a downright unwinnable matchup. But you look at the meta where all these trapless decks are trying to take over, and it's like Inzektors eat this up because, you know, Mermail, Atlantean, they don't even run hand traps. I mean, they run Trago, which is horrible against a deck like Inzektors. But even when you look at the decks outside of the ones I mentioned, look at a deck like Geargias, where everything they're doing is, I mean, their most optimal play outside of Gear Frame is setting a monster. And Inzektors love when you do that, because then it's like, summon Centipede, equip Hornet, blow that monster up, proceed to set protection, and just win, you know. And I don't know, I think the way that the meta has shaped up right now, I think Inzektors are a very viable deck. Now, are they the best deck? Absolutely not. I mean, there are ways to beat them. We already know what those ways are. Things like Macrocosmos, so they can't lose their monster. You know, the same cards that beat Dark World pretty much beat Inzektor for the most part. But I think that everything came together where Inzektors were off everybody's radar and hand traps are falling out of favor, and that basically plays right into the hands of the Inzektor player. Going forward, I think unless Samurai starts seeing a huge rise of play, I think Inzektors will probably be about a 1.5 tier deck. You know, I do think that the Mermail matchup can be a bit of a problem. I think Threatening War mitigates some of that problem. And then, you know, game 2, I think it's all in the hands of the Inzektor player, whether you side deck D-Fissure or Soul Drain. I don't think that they have a lot of good answers to that. I mean, they basically have Trap Stun, MST, or Bust. You know, there aren't a lot of things that they can really do. The problem is once you get rolling, you know, with Hornet, it's not like they can keep a roll to Kree up very quickly or for a long time. They can't keep Trap Stun set because chances are you're going after their back rows. So, I mean, it kind of plays into the hands of the Inzektors player. But I'm not going to overreact and be like, this is the best deck ever. I think it was a solid performance, and I think that Inzektors will be a very viable deck for the rest of the format unless everybody has kind of an overreaction, knee-jerk reaction, and everybody starts, you know, side decking like 3 Effect Veilers or whatever. But the fact that people aren't playing as many hand traps definitely helps Inzektors. So let me know what you guys think, and thank you for watching as always.